Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second day of our annual Energy Summit. Glad to have you all back with us for what will prove to be, I'm certain today, a very exciting set of conversations. We're very fortunate to begin today with a keynote discussion led by Bernie Mcnamee. He's going to be introduced more fully by George Fibby. He's a partner at Baker Botts. And then we will move directly from there to a panel discussion on the future of the continuing evolution, I should say, of electricity markets. So with that, George, it's a pleasure to see you again, and I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of run the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ken, and thanks again to all of our colleagues at the Baker Institute for all the hard work in putting this conference on, and it's been a pleasure to work with everyone there. As Ken mentioned, I'm George Fibby. I'm a partner in the energy regulatory practice at Baker Botts. And I'm very pleased to introduce Commissioner Bernie Mcnamee this morning. Commissioner Mcnamee earlier this month completed his term on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, as everyone watching this video I'm sure is aware. Commissioner Mcnamee, while he was at FERC, worked with his fellow commissioners and the team there to address a wide range of very important issues in the energy regulatory space, including regulation of the energy power markets, modernization of PURPA, enhanced reliability of the electric grid, as well as approvals of LNG export facilities, natural gas pipelines, and other matters involving oil and gas pipelines. Before joining FERC, Commissioner Mcnamee worked with the U.S. Department of Energy, where he was the executive director of the Office of Policy, and before that, the Deputy General Counsel for Energy Policy, where he was my colleague, and I was one of his other peer Deputy General Counsels there. During Bernie's career, he has also served in a number of important policy roles. He has served as a senior policy advisor for the U.S. Senator, a policy advisor for the governor of Virginia, as well as serving for four separate states attorneys general, both in Virginia and Texas. Bernie's background is as an energy lawyer, where he's been a partner at a major law firm. He was a partner at a major law firm for over 9 years. So with that, I turn it over to Bernie. We're all looking very forward to your remarks this morning, and thank you for presenting for us.
Thank you, George. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And, George and I did work together, and it was really great. And, not only is George a fantastic lawyer, he's also a good friend. And so I'm particularly happy to have been able to get together with him again, at least virtually. And I also want to thank the Baker Institute and Rice University for having me. This is a great honor to be able to be with so many leaders and thinkers and participants in the energy sector. And my biggest regret is that I can't be there with you in Texas. I grew up in Houston, and it's always good to come home and be back in Texas and get a little good barbecue again. As George mentioned, my background has been throughout my career in the energy area, whether it's been a lawyer representing clients before public utility commissions, getting generation facilities built, transmission lines done, or in the public policy realm, working, as George said, with attorneys general, or working in the U.S. Senate, or working at the Department of Energy, and ultimately as a commissioner at FERC. And one thing I've learned throughout my career is that you need to pay attention to the details and know what is going on. Everybody has a different perspective, and it's important to pay attention. When I was representing clients in private practice, I understood that time is money, that the cost of capital can go up if there's delays, there's uncertainty in the regulatory process. I understand in public policy that there's an important convergence between the public policy desires and the practical application of the law or regulations that can make big differences in the outcome. And ultimately, I learned that you have to pay attention to the details. At FERC, we issue over 1,000 orders each year, and it's important on each and every one to pay attention to what's going on in those cases. It's often easy for people to just focus on big issues and say, well, that's all that matters. But one thing that I think is very important that makes our democracy work is that people will accept adverse outcomes if they think that you paid attention to what they were saying in a case. And so I always try to look at each case as though it was the most important case, the most important order being issued, because to the parties involved, it was. But all these things I hopefully was able to bring together in working as a commissioner, but it's also given me some opportunities to think about the electric grid and how it operates. And, most importantly, I think we all recognize that the grid is in transition. Between state and federal policies and consumer preferences, we're seeing the promotion and the development of low emission generation resources and innovative technology. In fact, 29 states have established renewable portfolio standards, and many large customers across the country, like data centers, manufacturers, industrial customers, commercial customers, as well as residential customers, are seeking electricity to be provided by renewable or low-emitting resources. And this is having a profound effect on the development of the electric grid, and it's driving investment. I think many of us saw that the American Society for Civil Engineers recently issued a report saying that there was going to be a need for an additional $338 billion in investment over the next 20 years in the grid. And much of this investment is going to be driven by trying to meet the clean energy goals that are out there. And this investment is going to require innovation, but also that investment in renewable generation, new transmission lines, and groundbreaking technology. What is noteworthy about this, though, is that the investment is being driven by policy goals that will be replacing and perhaps replacing not fully depreciated existing generation assets with new generation facilities. And for those in the electric market and investors, this is a $338 billion opportunity to make new money. But we also have to remember that this is also going to have to be paid for by somebody. And that's going to be the residential, commercial, and industrial customers. And so we always have to have that in mind as we're working towards the transition, that there are great opportunities, but there are always going to be costs. But with this macro perspective on where the energy grid's going, I want to discuss some of the specific issues about the evolution of the power markets. Now, the creation of the competitive electric markets has been an incredible achievement. If you think about it, for over 100 years, we had electric service being provided by vertically integrated exclusive service territory utilities with cost of service rate making. And then with the enactment of the Energy Policy Act of 1992, and then the FERC Order 888 and its progeny, we started to have organized electric markets in the forms of RTOs and ISOs, with open access to transmission, creating new energy markets. And many of these markets were bid-based. And so the whole goal was to drive reliability and efficiency in the bulk power system. And it was ultimately for the benefit of end-use consumers. And this is going to be an important theme about what we're going to be talking about, is that the organized markets were based under certain premises to create the paradigm of those markets. And the fundamental premise there was that every megawatt of electricity was fungible. It didn't matter what generator was producing and what fuel was used to produce it. And as we know, when we were starting the markets, there were really four basic types of generation. There was coal, natural gas, hydro, and nuclear. And through purple, a little bit of renewables. We also knew at the time that the load curve was generally pretty easy to understand. It would start off low through the night, and through the morning it would start to rise, and then it would rise through the day to a peak. And then as the sun started to set, as people went home, as they were turning off their TVs or turning off their air conditioning, would go back down. And so the resources to meet this load curve were a combination of coal and nuclear, and those ended up being called base load. And then we had natural gas for intermediate and peak. And fuel costs were usually the key component for those energy costs, with natural gas being the relatively expensive fuel and setting the clearing price. In fact, let's remember, it wasn't that long ago then natural gas prices were spiking at about $13 a million BTU. And then it was hovering in the $5 to $9 range. So in this sense, electric markets were relatively uncomplicated. Efficiency, fuel costs, and heat rates were driving generation decisions. And such side benefits were almost inherent. We had reliability was usually an issue of turning a gas plant on and off, And we had ancillary services such as voltage control and frequency response were a byproduct of spinning reserves. And then coal and nuclear were recovering their capital costs and operating costs from the delta between their fuel costs and the natural gas clearing price throughout the day. So over time, there was some changes. There was a growing concern about environmental impacts of a lot of these resources. There were also technical innovations in public policy, like RPS programs, EPA regulations on emissions, and federal tax credits that were supporting the rise of alternative resources, particularly renewables. But because renewables have no fuel costs and are not dispatchable on demand, they began to impact both the generation stack and the load curve. Wind and solar with no fuel costs and with the benefit of tax credits could bid into the market at very low, be insured of being picked in the market and being paid the clearing price. So this had two impacts on natural gas and nuclear, really nuclear and coal. First, the clearing price was generally reduced, and second, certain coal and nuclear units could no longer afford to operate because they couldn't ramp up and down. So they either had to operate at a loss or they would shut down. Next, we had that innovation, the American energy renaissance, through hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling. And suddenly we had natural gas that was in the $2 range. And that meant natural gas plants could now no longer just be intermediate and peaking, but also in many cases baseload. So then we saw a third thing that was changing in the markets, and that was the rise of energy efficiency, demand response, and behind-the-meter generation, which was reducing load growth. So all these things were coming together to change the basic premises of which the markets were originally designed. It's not good or bad, it's just saying that there was change. And this also had some impacts about the issues of reliability. And that's been one of the challenges we've been dealing with in the transition. And I think it's useful to look at some examples of what's been happening in different RTOs and ISOs. Because the first thing to recognize is not every RTO and ISO is the same, but there are some certain themes that are going on. If you look at ISO New England, when they were shutting down coal and nuclear and increasing the renewable requirements, they couldn't always rely on natural gas to meet their peaks, especially during prolonged cold periods. We've seen there constantly that even though being near the Marcellus Shale formations, they've been unable to get new natural gas pipelines to the Northeast. And that has caused them to have to do two things. One, to mandate that there's dual fuel use on some of the generators, mainly a couple days worth of oil, or that they've had to get approval with FERC's blessing of the Mystic plants being able to use cost of service rate making to be able to cover gas costs from an LNG import facility. And that's the famous one where at times that they've had to import liquefied natural gas from Russia in order to ensure that they had enough fuel for the generators. In California, we already had seen the shutdown of a lot of coal and nuclear, and then they recently have had to delay shutting down gas plants. And this was before the recent blackouts. In fact, the California ISO had recommended, and the California PUC agreed, to basically keep 4,000 megawatts of natural gas generation running in order to help keep reliability going. Now, there's one other thing that you can see is that there's been a lot of speculation about the recent blackouts and what the cause is. And one thing we do know is that California had been importing a lot of power in order to meet its requirements. And as they were trying to rely more on either generation resources like natural gas or coal from other states or hydro, as you saw a decrease in hydro reserves, and as other states were seeing their renewables requirements going up, turned out that they didn't have enough extra power to necessarily be able to ship to California. Now, there's a lot of other issues going on, but this is another issue about having power on demand. In PJM, we've seen problems that even though they have very high reserve margins, every time there's a polar vortex, they seem to be straining the system. In ERCOT, it seems every summer that everybody's holding their breath. Is there going to be enough power if the wind stops blowing? And all these things come together as the issue of reliability. And it comes to the question of how are we going to maintain reliability? How can it be measured? And how can it be priced? Now, an initial observation, I alluded to it earlier, is I think we need to change the standards for reserve margins. I don't think it makes sense anymore to just look at the total amount of capacity that we have. I think we have to look at what type of capacity we have and when is it needed. I was fortunate enough when I worked at FERC to be able to go to the California ISO and go to the control room. And I was able to see about 11:50 in the morning, you look up at the control board, and almost 49% of the load was being served by solar. And this was remarkable, and about $1 an hour. But the problem was when the sun began to set. Another megawatt of solar was not going to solve their issue of needing more generation. And that's when it got me thinking really about it's no longer about just how many megawatts we have, but the types of megawatts we have. So with the reaction to some of these changes, we need to think about, well, what can we do? You know, the premise was we were trying to design markets initially to just have reliability provide in the most economic efficient manner. We've now, as we're starting to move to public policy concerns, particularly climate change issues, we're now saying that we also want to have cleaner emissions. And that's changing the dynamic of how the markets are operating. And what's been kind of interesting to think about is that we've been adding this new issue that we're trying to address, but trying to use the same paradigm to solve for it. And that's part of the reason I believe that we keep on seeing these tweaks and very indirect tweaks to the markets. You know, we've seen the addition of capacity markets. We've seen changes in reserve margins. We've then seen issues like adding new subsidies. We've seen new ancillary services. All these things get thrown in trying to get to the reliability problem without really saying that's what we're trying to solve for. And so we basically have had a market that there's a lot of things being thrown at it trying to solve what originally was just most economic efficient for reliability. And now we're saying we want reliability and clean energy. And that's fine, but we need to then adapt the markets, I believe, in order to accommodate that. And so, though many have said that, oh, it's the death or the demise of the electric markets, I actually think that report is premature. And I do think that there are ways that we can look at trying to change the markets. So I think as a starting point, we need to recognize that wind and solar, at least without large-scale storage, can't always meet reliability needs. This doesn't mean that we stop developing wind and solar. It's just to acknowledge the limits of those resources so we can start to think about how are we going to integrate them properly and make sure that we're able to provide reliability and reach clean energy goals. It also means that I think, as we said before, that we ought to stop planning about absolute peak and start focusing on the type of resources we need. You know, when I was in private practice, I helped get some solar facilities approved, and I also worked on getting the first 2 RPS programs approved in 2 states. But while working, I also worked on integrated resource planning, and I saw how a utility has to look at all the resources, how are they going to meet the load every day of the year, all times of the year, and be able to accommodate different changes in weather, loss of certain generation assets. And I think that we need to have perhaps more planning in the RTO and ISO link stage. Not saying it needs to be IRP planning, but probably more planning. And I think if we start thinking about these issues, we can price public policy goals and reliability properly. And this will also help us perhaps get rid of capacity markets, which as some have advocated, and maybe work towards more pure energy markets. But it would also help us rationalize what some are arguing is overbuilding of generation in order to meet peaks that really aren't being matched by what is needed. So I think if we're careful and we think about it, we can redesign the markets. I think it just is a requirement of just agreeing about what needs to be done, what we're trying to achieve, and therefore working together to find solutions. Now, I want to leave time for questions, but I will also say that besides the market issues, there are some other issues that we need to consider. Transmission is going to be a big issue. Of course, you know, long haul transmission is going to be a challenge, you know, because there's property rights issues, there's cost allocation issues, there's going to be issues about how we deploy storage, there's possibilities for microgrids, there's carbon pricing, there's a lot of issues out there, and I'm sure some of the questions will raise them. But what I can say is that at least during my time at FERC, one of the best parts about it was being exposed to so many of these issues and being able to think about them and work on them, and especially being able to work with so many people on the outside who are thinking about these things and these issues and coming up with really innovative solutions. So once again, I want to thank everybody for having me, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Appreciate your remarks, and we'll go ahead and start with a few questions for anybody else in the audience who would like to submit questions. Please feel free. Please do so on the function on your screen. I believe you can submit questions directly, and Barney, I'll tee a few of those up for you right now. So first of all, given the theme of our conference today and this week and next week, can you comment briefly or whatever your thoughts are on what can we learn from the pandemic? That is, what effect, if any, do you see the COVID-19 crisis having on the development of the grid going forward? Have we learned things from this experience that may impact the way we ought to be thinking about the power markets going forward?
Absolutely. I think everybody, in fact, how we're doing this here is we're able to work more from home. And, the Energy Information Agency said that we saw a decline of electric consumption about 2.4%, but there was a 6% decline in the industrial and commercial sectors and an increase of about 3.5% in the consumer sector. So what it's telling you is that there's a shift in consumption, and there's already been talk of a lot of people and a lot of businesses saying we may not go back to the big glass buildings anymore. And I think what that means is we need to think about how's the distribution grid being developed, how is generation being developed, and I think those are going to also create new opportunities for things like smart grids, microgrids, and in-home generation, solar panels on roofs and things of that nature. I just think that there's going to be some really interesting changes in our energy consumption, and that for whether it's distribution utilities or for independent power producers or transmission folks, it's going to create new opportunities and new challenges. But I think it's going to be interesting to see, in the next 3 to 5 years, was this merely a blip or did we really change our habits of consumption?
Thank you. The next question I'll put to you is, specifically as we talked about various technologies, new things coming into the market, there's so much investment right now in the energy transition, and it's going in a lot of that investment is taking shape in a lot of different directions. And so what are your thoughts on any particular technology, any particular efforts that you think are going to have the most create the most change or accelerate the energy transition the most in the coming years?
Well, two things that I find fascinating, and there's so many things that are exciting, but I think better use of existing transmission wires is going to be very interesting. As we get more sensors, we're able to do dynamic line ratings. I think there's going to be some really interesting aspects in that we're going to be able to better use the infrastructure that we already have. And that's going to benefit customers, but it's also going to benefit the grid. And I think one of the challenges is going to be how do we create the proper incentives in order to spur that sort of investment versus just building new wires. The other thing that I'm really excited about is something that we remember when we were at the U.S. Department of Energy is the work on small modular nuclear reactors. Recently, DOE announced, and I think it was NuScale, that they're doing new technology and got NRC, National Nuclear Regulatory Commission approval for small modular reactors, which are like 50 megawatts, and you can put together. And I think that could be a game changer, both in cost and deployment of nuclear power, which could have a big change in how things are done.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions I'll try to touch on that have come in from the audience. One is just in general, and I think this is largely, I'm interpreting it a bit to be from a regulatory perspective, but however you think best to answer. In general, what do you see the overall grid, the system looking like in 5 to 10 years? Well, how is it going to look different than it looks today?
Well, that's the big question, because that's about how are you going to deploy money and how are things going to change. I think there's a couple things. One, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all change. I don't think the entire U.S. is going to shift one way or another. What I do think is that particularly in the urban areas, I think you're going to see, because you have more people that are working in traditional office jobs that are going to be able to work from home, that it's more likely that you're going to see more people work from home, which means the distribution grid is going to have more that it's going to have to handle, and we're going to have to think about how generation is going to serve that. I think in other parts of the country that are still going to be manufacturing based, or farming or other things, you're going to not see that same sort of shift, and that there's though going to be opportunities for deployment of presumably more wind in the Midwest. You're going to see on the coast the use of offshore wind, and you're going to see the development of new technologies, whether it's hydrogen or small nuclear. So part of it's going to be driven by technology. A lot of it's going to be driven by public policy choices. And that's not just going to be at the federal level or at FERC. That's going to be states making decisions about the sort of energy they want, the sort of generation they want developed, and the sort of competitive enterprise they want providing service to the public.
Thank you. Not surprisingly, we've gotten a couple questions on carbon reduction. Obviously a broad topic. The question I would pose is, as there's more and more discussion of carbon pricing, how do you see carbon pricing efforts, if they do go into effect as a matter of policy, how do you see those rippling through the electricity markets? What are the implications of carbon pricing regimes that kind of play? How do you see that playing out? Not so much in whether pro or con from a policy perspective, but sort of the implications and effects of the carbon pricing proposals and regimes.
Sure. Well, some may be aware, FERC actually held what's called a technical conference earlier this week to talk about how would carbon pricing be implemented. Of course, Congress has tried, 70 times over the last 15 years to implement some sort of carbon regime, and have been unable to come up with a national policy on it. Obviously, states are implementing it in many different places. I think it's clear the carbon pricing, it can come in different forms. If it's a cap and trade, creates a little bit more economic efficiency in one sense. It may come though just from technology. we've seen dramatic reductions in carbon use in the at least from the energy sector, carbon emissions, just in the last 5 to 10 years, partly because of the American energy renaissance with natural gas replacing coal, and along with energy efficiency issues. But I think what you'll see is if there is carbon pricing, obviously that's going to change the types of resources and how they can compete and what makes them economical. And that goes, I think, to part of what I was talking about reliability issues. Is we need to recognize that whether we just are pursuing a carbon regime or having just the desire for more renewables just because of their other characteristics, which many of them can be very positive, we just need to think about how are we going to do pricing. And that's the key question, is how are we going to price it? And that's going to drive the change, because obviously if it becomes, you're going to have more renewables if they're cheaper, and you're going to have fewer renewables if they're not as competitive with other resources. But the key thing is going to be pricing that reliability. And depending on that, it might also impact things like storage and microgrids and other things of that nature.
All right, I think we have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to try to get two more in before we transition to the next panel. The first is sort of open-ended. Bernie, is there any other example on the international stage? That is there any are there any markets out there or nations out there that are doing things that could serve as a model for the U.S.? Obviously, we have a very different system than many other places. We have very different challenges, but nevertheless, are there any things that you see out there in the international sphere that you think provide good lessons or maybe help us chart a path forward in this country?
Well, I think there's different lessons to be taken generally, but I think for those if our main concern is about reducing emissions, the American model has actually been the most effective. The United States has been a leader in carbon emissions and a transition to the grid without having incredible spikes in energy prices. you look at Europe and many of their clean energy goals, but there's been a very high increase in the cost of electricity, including at times in Germany, in fact, that they've talked about electricity becoming a luxury. And I don't think the American people, one, will accept that. And second, there's a social justice issue about that. It's about, electricity has become a quality of life issue. And I think that we always need to keep that in mind.
Thank you. And with that, we are at time. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you for your comments. Everyone who's joined, please log in to the panel discussion that will follow. My colleague Andrea Stover will be moderating a panel on the evolution of the power markets. So please click to join in to that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.